Thanks very much for coming, and welcome to the third in our second season of Alumni Masterclass events, where we bring you our expert professors and lecturers at the University of Hull to share their insights and their interests in their subject areas. Tonight we're delighted to be looking at horror cinema with James Aston. It is totally a coincidence, actually, that it's in the run-up to Halloween. That was not intended, but it's a sort of lucky piece of serendipity. But I'm delighted that James has agreed to join us tonight, and I think it's going to be a great session. So James, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me to do this as well. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to try and do a Menti tonight, because I wanted it to be interactive and for you to have an opportunity to get involved with what we're talking about. As David said, you can also use the text boxes if you wanted to ask a question. There will be opportunities during the presentation to ask questions. And even if you put your hand up as well, David can notify me and you can speak if you had a question you wanted to ask. And don't worry if it's interrupting what I'm going through. I'm quite happy to take questions if and when they come up. We shall see how that goes. Okay, so let me have a look. There we go. Oh, that's wrong. Okay, everybody should be able to see that. On the next slide, there'll be the code to add to the Mentimeter. So what I want to do in the context of this hour, because we're quite limited and I wanted to get people involved, was to just look at an aspect of horror cinema that I feel is a little bit overlooked, and that is the aesthetics of horror. So when we talk about horror, we often talk about the meaning, what does the monster signify, the meaning behind the horror, how it connects to fears and anxieties that might be circulating at the time in which this film was made. And that can be quite difficult to do in this kind of context, because it means, it necessitates the group has seen the films that I'm talking about. So what I wanted to look at today was the jump scare in horrors. I'm going to show a few clips, so it doesn't matter if you haven't seen the film. And I wanted to look at how the frame in particular is constructed in these scenes. And so we can explore the formal properties, so editing, camera positioning, sound, performance, decor, lighting, all those kind of elements, to see if there are recurrent elements or even essential elements that have to be in place in a particular scene for it to scare us. So that's what I hope to achieve a little bit. Now, I've put this here, which is quite a provocative statement, maybe, that horror films, how do they horrify us? And I've crossed out horrify and put scare, because I really think that horror filmmakers don't want to horrify their audiences, because that's too strong, too disturbing. It's going to traumatize viewers too much. And I think that there's always a kind of barrier between the viewer and the horror film. I use the example maybe of the roller coaster. So there's a thrill, there's scares, there's a fear, but we know it's in a bounded, safe environment. We know that it isn't dangerous. It isn't going to necessarily impact on us for a long period of time. And I think horror also does that. But I want to talk a little bit about how it might pick up some of those necessarily horrifying elements and convert them into a safer format. And I thought that the jump scare was a good technique or aspect of the horror film in which to look at how filmmakers engage with potentially horrifying imagery, but in a way that makes it safer or more palatable to audiences, while still giving the requisite amount of scares and fearful reactions. Okay, so there's the code. Sorry, I should have put that right at the beginning, but I don't know what's come on to the third slide. So I'll wait a little bit while you enter that into Menti. My first question is if you can think of any examples of a particular film or even a scene from a film that gets under your skin, that stayed with you, whether it was whatever aspect of that is connected with you. I'm talking more about horror films here. It doesn't necessarily have to be a horror film, of course. It could be a scene that scared you, or disturbed you, or has just made an impact in some way. I just want to get a sense of the responses from the group. And I think when we see these films emerge, when you enter the particular films, maybe have a kind of reflect on the scenes that you're thinking about from these movies, and what is it particularly about those scenes that have impacted on you, that have produced, if you like, an affective charge, a kind of strong reaction, emotional reaction to them. So a number of films there, Shining, Silence of the Lambs, Blair Witch, all have certain moments that are quite famous, and certainly with Silence of the Lambs, the first one that came up, a number of scenes there that stayed with me when I went to see that at the cinema. And I remember I had a physics exam on the Monday in A-level, and I couldn't get Hannibal Lecter's face out of my mind. I couldn't concentrate on the revision the day after or the exam on the Monday, and needless to say, I failed my physics A-level. But it worked out in the end, because now here I am talking about Silence of the Lambs. Okay, Bird Box, Split, yeah, good. I think we're going to have a look at some of those films later on in this presentation. You'll notice that the opening image of the presentation was from Blair Witch, The Descent, Summer. Yeah, I mean, these were all great responses. And certainly Midsummer was a film that I mean, it was a while ago since I've seen that. Without saying too much about it, but even the opening 20 minutes of that film has such an impact, emotional impact on you. And then, you know, as the film develops, the bit with the cliff and the ending, certainly. Okay, but again, all these are great examples. Even if we can just briefly now think about what was it particularly about those scenes, and then keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, this session. Right, so I'm going to move on. So I apologise if not everybody has been able to add. I mean, you'll still be able to. We can. I think the mentee. I'll make sure that the mentee is available for everybody as well after, so you can have a look at some of the responses. Okay. Okay. So very briefly, I just want to talk about some elements that connect to horror, and why we're drawn to horror, but why horror perhaps gets to us and gets under our skin and might scare us and make us fearful. So first of all, the unknown. When I ask a question in one of my modules about what is it about horror, you know, why are we drawn to it, why the interest in horror, considering it might make us feel quite horrible, you know, has got a negative reaction, but yet we don't mind, and we're still drawn to it. And a number of students talked about the unknown, and how, again, within horror, this safe environment, this bounded environment, whether it's watching it at a cinema or at home on your own or with friends, you know that you might be experiencing quite difficult content, but it's still within the confines of a mediated experience. So you can experience these areas, these dark recesses of ourselves or of society, knowing that it's not going to be too confrontational, too dangerous. Now, I mentioned their subjective experiences, and that might be a case for some of the selections over page. I noticed The Descent, and that's a good example to use here, that if you were claustrophobic, for example, the impact of that film is going to be much more heightened for you than it is for somebody who doesn't suffer from claustrophobia, seeing as the film takes place underground in very confined, restricted environments. And I know that a lot of people have talked about how that tapped into the trauma. So, and fears and phobias. So your own experiences are very important, I think, in how a horror can affect you. The formal aesthetics we'll talk a little bit more about later, but how a scene is particularly constructed so that it becomes effective in scaring us or inducing fear within us. Thematic elements we might be drawn to, and they might again scare us. So big areas like environmental collapse, pandemic diseases, particularly at the moment, terrorism, war, all these kind of things horror can deal with that might make us feel uncomfortable or unsettled. Gore, again, you know, if we're looking at kind of body horror films where the body's under threat and is breaking apart, and that can be quite disturbing because of the highlights to us the materiality of the body, and it's quite abject, isn't it, when we see the body in those very precise and detailed ways. But we might also watch horror films because we find the gore pleasurable, especially if we're into artists such as Tom Savini, who does special effects for films like Dawn of the Dead. And we might like to see how he puts that together and take pleasure in seeing those practical effects. Watch what we're not supposed to, so we're drawn to the forbidden or the illicit. I think that's certainly the case with horror films. I grew up in the 1980s, so most of the decent horror films were banned and were difficult to get hold of. So that made me more inclined to seek them out and watch them. And when I got hold of them, I did feel that they again had a providence of these films had come from somewhere dangerous, somewhere threatening, because we weren't allowed to watch them. So that heightened the fear factor, perhaps, from those films. Breakdown of the real and the mimesis, or the construction, so the real and the fake. So if we suspend disbelief to an extent when we're watching these films, then that can have an impact again on our responses, and that becomes really important when we look at some of the clips coming up in a moment. Well, a sense of helplessness, inexplicable characters, a link to the real, I think those three areas are more aligned with horrifying aspects of horror cinema. So this is moving away from that bounded, safe environment to places where we don't want to go, where the barriers maybe drop down. And I wanted to highlight them because we'll see aspects of those in aspects of helplessness or inexplicable characters or the real in all of these jump scare scenes I'm going to show, but they're done in such a way as to kind of smooth around the edges so that we're not too affected by what we see. Okay, let me just move on. Very briefly, because I obviously don't want to go into too much detail or theory, but I highlighted right at the beginning of this presentation how a lot of approaches to horror has dealt with the themes and the meaning that the monster or the horror creates in the narrative of the film. And a lot of that stems, or the reasons for that stems from Robin Wood's seminal 1970 article about American horror in the 1970s, where he saw the monster as the return of the repressed. Everything that was repressed in society is bound to return in these traumatic and troubling ways. And from that, it's been picked up by a lot of academics and scholarly approaches since. And that has been at the disservice of not looking at the aesthetics of horror. And that's what I want to kind of concentrate on a little bit more today. So the techniques, the principles, devices, conventions, and images that have been effective in frightening and disturbing audiences over the past 100 or so years. Okay. So, and I'm going to narrow that down even further by focusing today on the cinematic frame and how it's put together creates a sense of fear and unease within the viewers, and certainly with the clips that I'm about to show. And I tried to get a VHS image of a horror film where it was really bad quality. Those horror films that came about in the 1980s, the advent of home cinema, a lot of films like Alien, Texas Chainsaw Massacre weren't of particularly great quality, so it was very difficult to see what was going on in these films, which meant that it heightened the fear factor, ironically, or maybe surprisingly, because we found ourselves looking across the frame for where these threats might emerge from. And when we've seen these films on 4K or Blu-ray, the quality is much better, and so we can see a lot more detail, and perhaps because of that, our fear isn't quite so as noticeable or as apparent as when it was when we saw these films in a slightly degraded quality. So I just wanted to mention that because our first example that I want to use is from Paranormal Activity. So if we can have a look at this frame and put a dot where you are looking, and I maybe suggest staring at the frame for maybe 20-30 seconds to see if your eye wanders around and where it comes to rest. Now, this is a found footage film in which there are strange, potentially supernatural happenings going on in the house. So they set this camera up overnight, and it's static and it's one take, and it's just of this image. It may go on for 30 seconds, it may go on for 2 minutes, and we find ourselves maybe initially focusing on the couple who are asleep in bed, but then our eye is drawn to various parts of the image where we think the potential threat might emerge from. So I'll just give a bit of time for people to put their dots where they're looking. So as we can see from the responses so far, not everybody's looking in the same place, and I wouldn't have expected that because of the way that this scene is set up. What I like about this scene in particular, and when we come on to our first clip, you'll see how that film uses depth of frame. So we have in the foreground here, we have the bedroom with our characters, which we may think that's where the action is going to happen because this is where the human characters are. And then I feel we drift off towards that space on the left-hand side. Now, it's difficult to make out what's going on there, but there is a staircase or stairs going down, and then there are two doors at the back opening up into further spaces. And when we're watching the film, we'll sometimes hear noises, inexplicable noises that we can't quite place where they're coming from, which again dictates where we might look. And I do think we start off looking at the characters. We look around the bed, the window, we look under the bed, or we're looking towards under the bed, and then we might be looking outside through the door. And I think this is just very effective because it well, I suppose forces the audience to search the frame because there's that depth and there's a lot going on, and I think it builds up that anticipation, builds up that tension that something's going to happen, but something could happen from various different points. It could happen through the window, under the bed, through the door, towards the staircase, and of course during the film it does happen from a number of places. So we're constantly on edge when we see these images about what's going to happen and what's going to happen next. So I thought that would just be a good example of how horror filmmakers and how horror films use the frame very effectively to manipulate our responses, and in this case by using a single frame, a long single take. Okay, thank you. So I'll move on now to what's next. Okay, so here's my first clip. It's not the clip, this is the image which takes up the main part of the clip. Some of you may recognize the film. This is considered the most effective jump scare in the history of horror films. And it's the debatable status, but there we go. So again, I started with Paranormal Activity which is a 2006 film, and then we move to this movie. It's not found footage, but you'll notice when you see the clip that actually it's filmed in a very realist style with long takes. There is an edit in the middle, and it goes back to this long take where the camera's fixed. And I thought it replicated that depth of field, depth of vision that we see in Paranormal Activity. And we know something's going to happen. Where is it going to come from? And so before we've seen the clip, where is your gaze? Or what are you looking at? Okay, so again, I would totally expect to see these dots all over the frame, which I think makes it why it's such an effective scene, because you're right, there's two doors on our left. The threat could come out of there. There's there's the two characters, so there's a policeman and a nurse, or the security guard. So we're focused on them because that's where the threat could happen. And we're looking through the doors as well, looking through the doors. David, I just wanted to ask that if the sound for clips has been turned on Teams. I forgot to do it beforehand. It probably has, but if people, if it hasn't, and I don't think people will be able to hear the clip.
I'm not sure. To be honest, James.
We'll go for it, and if people can't hear, they can tell me, and I'll try and stop. Try and turn it on. Okay. Right. So this is the Exorcist 3. William Peter Blatty, because he wrote The Exorcist. 1990. Right. So let me put this on. So can I just get a thumbs up that people can hear that? Or,
I couldn't hear it actually.
Okay. Let me see if I can. There's a button to press. Let me. I don't know what to do. It's going to be an issue. I don't suppose anybody knows what. There is definitely something I just need to click on to make sure that sound is on the. I'm not sure where it is. Otherwise, these.
I think you have to click on it before you share your screen.
Okay, so if I come out of that and go back in, is that all right? Let's try that then. Okay, so you're back. Everyone's back to this screen. Okay. And then, sorry, I'm.
When you hit the share button, there's a little box saying include system audio, and you check that and then share, and then we should be able to hear it.
Kevin, thank you very much. Okay. Right, so we're back. Okay. Right. Thank you.
Yes, I'm fine. I'm just a little jumpy. That's all.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't know whether that's the most terrifying jump scare of all time, but I really like the way that the scene is put together and constructed. The way that we've got that long static take at the beginning, a very realist approach. There's no music. The sound is all within the frame, and then we have that very, I think, effective and clever edit when we go to the close-up of the nurse as she hears this strange, inexplicable, maybe, sound behind the door. She investigates. It's not there. There's still movement going on around the frame, so the guy comes in to signal the other security guard. They leave. She closes the door, and then the threat comes from the corridor, maybe somewhere we're not expecting. And then we get these very stylistic developments, so breaking that realist code that we've got with those long takes, observing the characters and that space. So very quick zoom edit, and then the sound effect, the non-diegetic sound, which was meant obviously to increase our fearful reaction to that particular sequence. It's difficult showing these things out of context because we may be watching the movie and feel quite unnerved already, and that's going to heighten our response to that scene. But I just wanted to show it anyway, seeing as it's considered one of the most effective, and the way that it's shot, it does have almost found footage elements to it that we've just seen with Paranormal Activity, breaking down, if you like, the constructed and the real. Okay. Okay, so here's the next image, or the next frame, shall I say. So people again want to see where to put the dot, where we're looking at. Okay. Okay, so this is, well, yeah, I mean, I tried to capture an image towards the end of this particular sequence, but because of the quality of the image capture, it's very dark. But in a way that works well, because what we have here, again, is quite an inexplicable scene. We don't know really what's going on in the film, which I'll come and talk about in a moment. It's somebody finds these videos in the loft and starts putting them on, and it features these horrific content. This particular scene where this jump scare is this found footage, but it's in a more conventional movie that has these found footage inserts. And so we see this unseen, unknown person pushing this lawnmower, and it's dark, and his light that they've got is focused on the lawnmower, and we can't see anything around us. So we're anticipating something's going to happen, but unlike the scene we've just seen, the frame is much more restricted. But I think when we look at the scene, the way that it's put together and the way that it's delivered to the viewer is still very, very effective, and uses that restricted frame very effectively. As some of you have put there, you know, your gaze is moving out into this negative space around the lawnmower. We are waiting for a threat, but we are, you know, it's difficult to anticipate where it's going to come from, or what indeed it's actually going to be, what is going to make us jump, what is going to scare us. And okay, so I'll put the clip on. So it's from Sinister, which I mean, it was a 15 when it came out in the UK, but this is a PG-13, and I'm going to can imagine how it got past the censors. But when you're looking at this particular scene, have a look at some of the other formal properties. Where we looked at Exorcist 3, we had these realist codes, you know, a long take. Here we get the same thing. Somebody's filming in a cinema verite style, this family inside a home. But it also uses very stylistic elements as well, just as The Exorcist 3 did. And we'll return to this at the end of the presentation when I asked the question about whether some of the formal properties of these scenes you found very effective. So was the zoom in to the nurse and the sound effect that went with it, did that work? You know, did it make the scene much more effective? Similarly here, when the jump scare happens, there's a very abrupt edit, and I wonder if that heightens our response, or whether it is actually takes us out of the scene and of the moment. Okay, so here I go. Okay, so again, we've got quite, you know, realist codes to start it off, as if it's found footage. You'd have noticed if I don't know what the sound was like at your end, that it's played without sound, but the closer you listen, you notice there's a low drone sound on the footage as well. So that's kind of a bit bizarre that would be on there, as somebody manipulated this footage prior to Ethan Hawke's character watching it. You also know there's edits as well. So somebody has obviously done something with this found footage. I don't know whether that's acknowledged in the film or whether it's, you know, just left out there. And then again, it's inexplicable. So he's starting this lawnmower, whoever this character is, and then he goes across the lawn, and then for no apparent reason, there seems to be it's a young child, male child, and he goes, you know, he runs over the child's face, and just as that happens, it cuts to the reaction from Ethan Hawke. And so when we come back to this, I want you to think about how that scene's constructed and whether it's effective in then bringing us back into the more conventional film at the end, in that very abrupt kind of shot cut back to the reaction of Ethan Hawke, whether that mirrors and enhances our own reaction to that scene, that precise moment just before. Okay, let me move on to the final one. So again, here we go, another scene where there's a famous jump scare. So again, got a lot of space, a lot of things going on in this particular scene. Okay, so again, I mean, the character's fallen downstairs in the basement. We always associate the basement with nefarious things in horror movies. And then we see this particular frame, the way that it's shot. And again, judging by all the blue dots, the threat, potential threat, could come from anywhere. Notice that some of the production design here, the looks like blankets or sheets, could resemble human or monstrous forms, which heightens our anticipation that something's going to happen. Now, this clip is very different, I think, from the two previous clips, in that it's almost throwing everything at the screen in trying to manipulate the viewer into a disoriented state to increase their sense of fear when the jump scare happens. So you'll notice the very short scenes, a lot more edits. There's a spatial kind of confusion in the scene made out by the various camera angles. So we don't quite get a sense of where rooms are in relation to each other. And as the scene goes on, the frame kind of degrades. So our vision becomes restricted. We don't know where to look. Here we've got the light, it illuminates. That's not necessarily the case as the scene goes on. So it uses a lot of techniques, a lot of very stylish flourishes in this sequence. And again, if we compare it to those previous two, where we have more of a realist codes going on for those jump scares, is this more effective again? Does it heighten our reaction to the film, or does it, does it put us within this constructed environment where we anticipate what's going to happen and maybe it doesn't scare us quite as much? Okay, so this is The Conjuring by James Wan. So here we go. It's a longer scene, this as well, you'll notice. So she's kind of playing hide and seek or hide and clap with whether is it a child or it's a horror film, so it's bound to be a supernatural entity.
Who's ever down there? I'm gonna lock you in now!
Wanna play hide and clap?
Okay. A little mischievous myself in that. Obviously, the image beforehand was a form of misdirection, as filmmakers are off to do with their films. The reason that I wanted to show that one, and although it doesn't work perfectly, James Wan, the director, identifies the threat behind the character, behind the camera almost. So I know that the camera moves to look at the character there. But if we go all the way back to Paranormal Activity, we know that the threat is going to be in front of us. And there have been films, especially found footage movies, that have located the threat from coming behind the camera. And when we think that the threat now is both in front and behind us, it makes for a very uneasy experience. And James Wan's playing around with that in that film, all these different camera positions and edits to disorientate the viewer. And then right at the end, where we think that the jump scare is going to come in the basement, he misdirects and then has it at the top of the stairs. But you'll also notice that even though it's a very stylized scene, that James Wan still uses kind of realist codes, or codes we might associate with found footage, and that being the deterioration of the image or the deterioration of the camera. So as she runs up the stairs, the light goes off, it goes into pitch blackness, we can't see anything. And that reminds me of Blair Witch Project, which used a very amateurish, degraded capture of what was going on. And most times it was out of focus or out of sync, or there was no sound, or in some cases it was complete darkness. The camera wasn't on, it was just capturing the sound. And yet that really combined to a very eerie, disturbing and scary experience. And James Wan builds into that with the lighting of the matches. We expect to see something, and so there's that anticipation of that restricted frame, which I thought was very good. Okay, so to end, I think we are getting towards the end. I just wanted to ask this question about looking at those 3 clips. Were there any formal properties? Were there any aspects of those clips that you thought was significant and really helped with creating fear? I could widen that question out to say if there was anything you took from those clips that you found personally important or significant or interesting, then please add it here, yeah, and then we can see what emerges. Okay, so I'll go through a few of those responses. I thought, by asking this question, we could identify some key formal properties that need to be in place. We've looked at the frame, and I think the importance of the frame in creating fear as the audience seeks out particular areas that they think the threat's going to come from. There's a certain pleasure in doing that, perhaps, but it really builds anticipation. Go back to Exorcist 3. Where's the threat going to come from? We know it's going to come from somewhere, and I think that's can be really effective. I mean, there's a couple of responses there about sound. So the use of music, non-diegetic sound, but also silence as well, that I think really works effectively in some of those scenes. And the soundscape in horror is of crucial importance, I think, and it has to be effectively, I think, put in place for scenes to be effective. And I think in all those cases, even when we get on to Sinister or Exorcist 3, when the jump scare happens and we get that non-diegetic sound, it works well. When the character in The Conjuring falls down the stairs, we have that dramatic music that really increases the sense of peril that she's in now that she's in the basement. So a lot of, let me go through a few other things. I thought performance, someone's mentioned facial expressions there. I think performance is very important because we don't want to get thrown out of the scene bad acting or unconvincing performances or over-the-top performances. If you look at Exorcist 3, it's almost as if it's a fly-on-the-wall documentary. We're just seeing these characters move around that space. The character in The Conjuring as well, there has to be an effective sense that she's scared, that she's in peril, concerned, worried, whatever. So I think performance is really important as well. And even the reaction from Ethan Hawke in his big cardigan that he's wearing is effective, and it might mirror exactly our response to that scene. So I thought that was a good alignment between the character in the film and potentially the audience. Okay. I did this on a word cloud, and the words are getting smaller and smaller on this computer. The sense of anticipation, that's right in the middle there, works really well in these scenes, certainly the first two, and certainly Exorcist 3. So I can see why people identify that as one of the most effective. And building up a scene, building up a jump scare, tends to be what happens most often. It can happen completely out of the blue, and that can still be very effective. I'm thinking of the jump scare in Hill House, the Mike Flanagan TV series, where the two women are talking in the car, and then inexplicably and very unexpectedly, the head forces its way from the back into the front. This supernatural entity. That's very, very effective, because they're having a very detailed, in-depth conversation, a very serious conversation. So we wouldn't expect the insertion of a jump scare, and when it happens, it works very well. A couple of other elements about the everyday, the kind of quotidian, or the safe space, hospital, the home, and again, I think that maybe links to our own subjective experiences. The home in particular, a place where we can feel safe. When it becomes under threat, we can relate to it because it's a very familiar environment for us, albeit it's rendered unfamiliar, perhaps in these films, with the advent of a supernatural, monstrous entity or force. Okay. I haven't got a question to ask about this, but maybe we could add the film clips to this word cloud. I wondered, for people who hadn't seen the clip, well, people in general, which you thought was the most successful, the most effective, and maybe give a very brief reason why.
James, are you happy for people to maybe come in on microphone or write in the text chat as well? Maybe an answer to that question.
Yes. Anyway, I'm totally happy with you. Sorry, I can't see anything but the word cloud. So but yeah, I'm happy. Whatever way they want to communicate.
Tazira did mention just building dread there. I just thought, like, for me, part of the building of dread is it's not only in what we are shown on the camera, but actually the deliberate withholding of images and information, knowing that they are going to sort of show something at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, all of those three clips, they don't expose the horror completely, so we don't really see the monstrous entity in Exorcist 3, because it's just a very, very quick edit, isn't it? So we get a sense of it, but we can't fully process it. Same in Sinister as well. We don't see the figure, but the child on the lawn, we just get a very brief glimpse at. And maybe that's another element of withholding the horror, keeping it out of sight, and how that can again build tension and anticipation and fear for certain. Yeah.
William writes, Sinister because of the very long build-up and restricted field of vision. And Kath suggests Exorcist 3, such a normal scene that develops into something unexpected. Threat comes from somewhere we don't expect.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, I mean, take Exorcist 3, it seems like a strange setup. But when you know something's going to happen, and there must be something that's going to happen anyway, because why would the camera be set up in this way? Why is it going on for so long? Why hasn't it moved on to another scene? Or why hasn't it returned to a more conventional filmmaking, say, a conversation between the security guard and the nurse? And it does really build our tension because of that. And you know, it's a very it's an uncommon sense we get in Sinister, of course, that there's a threat straight away because the guy is, or whoever it is voyeuristically looking at this family. We think the family might be under threat. We see the intruder in the way we might align with the slasher films. We always get the POV of the slasher as he stalks and slashes or stalks his victims, and then it just moves to that scene outside. So it really throws us. We don't know what's going on, why all of a sudden he's picked up the lawnmower, and so I think that move from having a privileged gaze, because he's there looking at them, they're unaware, to them moving into the, it looks like the garden, and having that very restricted vision is a good contrast, and it really does heighten that sense of anticipation. We're going to see something horrible. I can't remember what's the first video he sees, so I don't know whether we are expecting something or whether it was completely unexpected. I'd have to rewatch the movie.
We've had a few more people writing. So Charlotte's is Sinister. Shaky camera and limited vision gives a sense of realism. Edward says Exorcist 3 is the greatest. The view is both very open, unsure of where the threat is going to come from, and limited by the hallway, creating a sense of no escape. Murphy says that the last clip, it was a domestic setting, so you can insert yourself into the scene. A child's voice is always very sinister too.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with Sinister, looking at those realist codes and found footage codes that the film deploys in that film, they're like, it's not a found footage movie, but the films that he finds are presented to the audience in that way, although they are strangely manipulated. But breaking that barrier down between the real and the constructed, I think, can lead to very effective horror, because of course it brings us closer to it. And a lot of found footage films do have that immersive and intimate contact or relationship with the viewer. We're following the characters in that film, and if we're following the murderer, that can be a really disturbing and unsettling position for the viewer. And it's something that's often avoided in found footage films for obvious reasons, because they don't want the audience aligned with the killer. But in those short videos, we are, and that might make the scene more effective, more disturbing, perhaps because it's the killer's point of view, or whatever that figure is, the monster, the horrific entity. And I mean, I think the production design and the sense of space in Exorcist 3 is incredible. And the more you think about it, the more impressive that setup is. And you know, it does anticipate and foreshadow the use of the long take and deep field of vision in a film like Paranormal Activity, and the use of that in found footage films. And I'd also agree with The Conjuring being this invasion of the home, and that can be deeply scary and unsettling, because we see the home commonly as a place of solace and as comfort and as, you know, and love and security. So there's, you know, the home invasion film really plays on those fears.
Desiree references Ethan Hawke's response. I wasn't sure what the lawnmower had struck, but his expression, an entire body response, punctuates and confirms the absolute horror of what was there. Kevin asks, can you explain more about what you mean by found footage? And Edward, Exorcist 3 is well lit by breaking the conventions of horror It makes the audience more uncomfortable as they don't expect a jump scare in such high key lighting. Characters move in and out nonchalantly, creating the sense that the murder could easily be avoided by making it more grisly and cruel.
Yeah, the point about The Exorcist being in, you know, in the bright lights is a good one, because we tend to find horror in a more murky, more restricted view of vision. I think that was when I'm thinking of Halloween as well, when all of the violence takes place at night, but we get a lot of the movement of Michael around Haddonfield in the daytime, and it's quite unusual to see films in that kind of well lit environment, and maybe that makes more of an impact as well. I think in terms of found footage, this is. I mean, it's complex in either it's been found by somebody, whether it might be a government agency, it might be the military, and it's been put together, and then we're watching a put together version of that. So in Cloverfield, it would be an example that it's video footage to start with. Almost they're filming a party, and then a monster attacks Manhattan, and they film the ensuing events. It's a spoiler, but it's everybody dies, and the military find the tape, and they put it back together, and that's what we're watching. So that tends to be one of the more popular ones. Or we have footage that's not found, but it's happening in real time. So there's maybe a camera crew, and they're filming something, and that might be quite innocuous or conventional, and then something happens that changes the direction of the narrative, and then it moves into horror territory. And then we also get found footage that is inserted into more conventional films like Sinister, or the most famous one would be Cannibal Holocaust, I suppose, where they find these videos from a documentary crew that went missing in the Amazon, and they decide to try and put it together for a documentary. But that's a conventional film, but then it has moments of found footage. So it really tries to pass off the footage as real. And even if we're watching monster invasions or zombie attacks, there's this idea that if it was to happen, it would look like this. And so it really can be very, well, it can produce a very strong emotional response, because we are there with the characters, experiencing kind of what they're going through, breaking that barrier down between the real and the constructed. And very popular in the first decade of the 21st century, in a post 9/11 environment, where a lot of amateur testimony and video testimony was captured of the attacks on the Twin Tower, and from that, it's picked up by filmmakers, and the style was copied as producing a more authentic and realist document account.
One last comment here, just from Edwards, just saying, I think referring to his previous comment on The Exorcist 3, not only does the killer appear in high key lighting, but he also walks into the centre of the frame, creating the idea in the audience that nowhere is safe from the antagonist. Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? Space in horror films anyway. When that space is violated in the way that it is in Exorcist 3, then it really puts us on edge afterwards, because we understand from that particular scene, even if it goes on for a couple of minutes, that the horror, the threat, could appear at any time. So it's not as if it's in a more conventional, stereotypical way, and it was at night time, and it's in particular places, and from particular directions. But it could be anywhere, and nobody's safe. And again, it builds into some of the comments made on the word cloud about anticipation. It really creates that anticipation, which again goes back to maybe the roller coaster. We anticipate going over the top and the drop, or the loop. You can see that in advance, and it gives us great pleasure. But at the same time, it brings around a fear, or quite a strong response in us as well. Okay.
Okay. So I'm back. I think I've stopped sharing my screen now. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I suppose that's everything. I think. Yeah. Thank you very much for attending. I hope it was interesting. I know that it's difficult to cram everything into an hour like we've done, but I hope it's given you opportunities to think in more detail next time you come across a horror film and the way that it's put together and constructed, and how that links to how you respond to the film and the horror on display.
Thanks, James. There's a few messages of thanks just being posted in the meeting chat there, which I'd like to add my own thanks to. It's been a really interesting talk, a really fascinating and refreshing look at some horror movies. I think also putting the jump scare shots on there, and knowing that we're watching a jump scare has added a little bit to the tension for me, which has been a nice sort of Halloween spooky sort of event before the children come back and add some scares of their own. But no.
Thank you. No, some nice comments. It's a lot. Yeah.
And thank you to everybody in the audience as well for joining us this evening. As always, let us know what you think about tonight. Let us know what you'd like to see from the masterclass sessions going forwards, and hopefully we'll see you again at an event again in the future. But thank you very much, James. That was great.
Thank you, David, again for inviting me to do this. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.